The scent of beeswax and old roses clung to the air in the drawing room, a sweet and drowsy perfume that never quite masked the chill seeping from the stone floors of Blackmore Manor. Cecily Thorne ran a gloved finger along the gilded edge of a porcelain vase, adjusting a spray of late-blooming hellebores by a fraction of an inch. Her movements were economical, precise, the result of 5 years spent learning the geography of a house that was not hers, in the service of a woman who was not kind. Lady Honoria Vane, Dowager and Dragon, liked her flowers arranged just so. She liked her companion silent, her tea hot, and her authority absolute. Cecily had mastered the art of being present but invisible. A ghost in grey bombazine who managed the household accounts, read aloud from tedious histories, and absorbed the day's allotment of petty cruelties with a placid expression that was her finest, most defiant creation. A carriage rattled on the gravel drive outside, the sound of its approach a disturbance in the suffocating quiet of the afternoon. Lady Honoria stirred from her throne-like chair by the fire, her lace cap trembling with irritation. "That will be my nephew," she announced. As if a guest were an imposition she had unfortunately been forced to endure. "The Duke. See to it that you are not underfoot, Miss Thorne." "Yes, your ladyship." Cecilia's voice was low and even, a practiced calm that gave nothing away. She was always underfoot. It was the essential nature of her position. She moved toward the hall to ensure the butler was ready, her steps making no sound on the thick Aubusson carpet. The Duke of Ravenshaw. She had heard of him, of course. Who in the county had not? A man of immense power, and it was whispered, of immense and sorrowful reserve, a widower with a young daughter who was said to be as silent as a shadow. Grief, Cecily knew, could make a fortress of a man, and a duca's fortress would be colder and more impregnable than any other. The great oak door swung open, and for a moment the watery afternoon light framed him. He was taller than she had imagined, broad in the shoulder, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from granite and left out in the wind. There was no warmth in it. His dark hair was cut severely, his jaw set in a line of harsh control. He held the hand of a small girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, who was his miniature in mourning. She wore a black coat and a solemnity that was too heavy for her small frame. Her eyes, wide and dark like his, were fixed on the floorboards. "Sebastian," Lady Honoria's voice, cut through the air, sharp as shattered glass. "The roads were poor, Aunt," the Duke replied. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of apology or explanation. It was a statement of fact. He noticed the butler's tired eyes. He noticed the faint layer of dust on a side table the maids had missed. He noticed the way his daughter's hand was cold in his. And then his gaze swept past Cecily, as if she were a coat stand. "Your things will be taken to the West Wing," Lady Honoria was saying. "The girl can have the nursery." The child, Clara, flinched at the word, a girla, a tiny, almost imperceptible tightening of her fingers around her father's hand. "And Miss Thorne," Lady Honoria said, her eyes glinting with the particular pleasure she took in issuing commands that served no purpose but to demonstrate her power. "Fetch the blue cashmere throw from my chambers. There is a draught." "Of course, my lady." Cecily curtsied, a shallow dip of her head and shoulders, and turned to go, grateful for the task, for the excuse to melt back into the machinery of the house. She was halfway up the grand staircase when their voices drifted up from the hall below, clear and distinct in the cold, still air. "She is looking well," the Duke observed, his tone flat. He was speaking of Cecily. Lady Honoria sniffed. "She is useful. I shall have her join us for supper this evening. It will save the staff an extra tray." There was a pause, a silence so profound, Cecily could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. When the Duke finally spoke, his voice was stripped of all civility, reduced to a blade of pure, cold dismissal. "I'd sooner dismiss her than dine with her, Aunt. She is staff." The words struck Cecily with the physical force of a blow. She stopped, her hand gripping the polished oak of the banister, her knuckles white. It was not the sentiment that wounded her. She had been reminded of her station 1,000 times in 1,000 small ways. It was the casual brutality of it, the utter lack of regard. He had spoken of her as one might speak of a piece of furniture that was in the wrong room. An inconvenience. She is staff. The phrase echoed in the sudden emptiness inside her. It was the truth, of course. A poor gentlewoman with opinions is a luxury no household can afford, and Cecily had long ago learned to afford nothing but silence and service. But to hear it said aloud, by him, with such arctic finality, it scraped away the fragile dignity she wrapped around herself each morning, like a shawl. She did not move. She waited, her breathing shallow, for her composure to refasten itself. Below, she heard her employer's clipped retort, a sound of sly victory. Nonsense, Sebastian. This is my house. In my house, we are not so precious about the seating arrangements. She will dine with us. It is settled. Another silence. Longer this time? Cecily imagined the Duca's jaw tightening, the displeasure hardening his already severe features. He was a man accustomed to his will being law, but Lady Honoria was one of the few people left in the world who could, and would, defy him for sport. Finally, a curt clipped sound of assent, more a grinding of teeth than a word. Cecily drew a slow, deliberate breath. She released the banister. Her hand did not tremble. She continued up the stairs, each step a victory of control over the tremor that threatened to begin in her knees. To refuse the summons to supper would be an act of defiance against Lady Honoria, an unforgivable sin that would cost her the roof over her head. To accept was to place herself at a table, across from a man who found her presence so offensive he would rather see her cast out into the world. She fetched the cashmere throw. She brought it down and draped it over her ladyship's lap, her movements fluid and calm. She did not look at the Duke. She did not need to. She could feel his gaze on her, cold and heavy as a winter stone. He knew she must have heard. And she knew that he did not care. Men are slow, child, and dukes are slowest of all. And grief makes fools of the cleverest of us. He saw a companion, a servant, another complication in a life already burdened by a title and a sorrow he did not know how to carry. He did not yet see the woman, but the seeing was about to begin. Later, in the quiet of her small, sparsely furnished room, under the eaves, Cecily prepared for the ordeal. She had one good gown, a dress of dove-gray silk, she had made herself, its only adornment, a row of tiny self-covered buttons at the cuff. It was the color of a winter sky, a color that asked for nothing and promised the same. It was her armor. As she fastened the buttons, she looked at her reflection in the wavy, age-spotted glass. A pale face, serious brown eyes, and a mouth that had forgotten the habit of smiling, composed and watchful. That was what the world saw. Inside, she made a vow. It was not a prayer for strength, but a setting of terms with herself. She would go down to that dining room. She would sit at that polished mahogany table. She would not flinch or stammer. She would not apologize for the space she occupied. She would eat her food. She would answer if addressed. And she would meet every cold glance and barbed comment with the unassailable dignity of a woman who knew her own worth, even if no one else in that room did. She would not be made small. That was her condition. She owed it to the memory of the father who had taught her to read Latin and to value truth above all things, even when the world offered no reward for it. The dining room at Blackmore was a cavern of mahogany and gloom, lit by a constellation of candles and a silver branch that did little to push back the encroaching shadows. The fire crackled in the hearth, a lonely sound in the vast, echoing silence. Cecily took her seat, the one indicated by a stony-faced footman, directly across from the Duke. He did not acknowledge her presence. His attention was fixed on the starched white expanse of the tablecloth before him, his expression unreadable. To his right, his daughter Clara sat perched on a chair too large for her, a small, silent doll in a black dress. Her feet did not touch the floor. Her eyes were cast down, studying the intricate pattern on her porcelain plate as if it held the secrets of the universe. The first course was served. A watery soup. The only sounds were the clink of silver on china and the sharp, interrogating tone of Lady Honoria's voice as she began her usual nightly dissection of the day's failings. The gardener is a fool. The roses are blighted, she declared, her gaze sweeping the table as if to challenge anyone to disagree. And the new maid is clumsy. I shall have to let her go. Cecily kept her eyes on her soup. She had bandaged the new maid's scalded hand. Just that afternoon, a girl of 15, terrified of losing her position, she said nothing. The country is becoming intolerable, Lady Honoria continued, turning her attention to her nephew. Full of incompetence, I cannot imagine how you manage an estate the size of Ravenshaw. I have a good steward, the Duke said, his voice clipped. A good steward is no substitute for a wife, his aunt replied, her words dropping into the silence like stones into a well. A house needs a mistress. A child needs a mother. At the word a mothera, Clara's small shoulders went rigid. A spoon, held loosely in her fingers, slipped and clattered against her plate. The sound was unnaturally loud. The Duke's hand, which had been resting on the table, closed into a tight fist, his jaw hardened. The subject is not open for discussion, he said. The words were low, but they carried a weight of command that momentarily silenced even his aunt. Lady Honoria, thwarted, turned her malicious attention to the weakest person at the table. Her eyes, small and bright as a bird's, fixed on Cecily. Well, Miss Thorne, she began, her voice dripping with false sweetness, you are very quiet this evening. Has the grandeur of the occasion stolen your tongue? Cecily met the older woman's gaze. I was always taught it is polite to listen when others are speaking. My lady, she said, her voice perfectly even. A flicker of annoyance crossed Lady Honoria's face. The answer was too direct, too simple to be twisted into insolence. She tried another tack. We were just discussing the importance of a proper family. You would know little of that, I imagine. Miss Thorne comes to us from rather unfortunate circumstances, Sebastian. One must be charitable to those whose families have fallen. She smiled, a thin, cruel curve of her lips. She was dangling Cecilia's past like a piece of bait, waiting for her to flinch, to show the shame that was expected of her, the ruin, the whispers that had followed her from her old life to this one. The story of a father who had trusted the wrong man, lost everything, and in his despair, had taken the one thing no one could take from him again. Cecily laid her spoon down beside her bowl. She looked directly at Lady Honoria, her expression calm, her gaze unwavering. The circumstances were indeed unfortunate, my lady, she said, her voice clear and carrying in the quiet room. My father taught me that truth is never a thing to be ashamed of. He was a good man who was betrayed. There is no shame in that. Her plain moral courage was a weapon Lady Honoria did not know how to counter. It offered no apology, no weakness to exploit. It simply stated a fact, for the first time all evening. The Duke of Ravenshaw looked at her. He truly looked at her. His gaze moved from his aunt's pinched, malevolent face to the woman seated opposite him. He had dismissed her, categorized her, rendered her invisible. She is staff. But the woman he was looking at now was not invisible. She was poised and self-possessed, meeting a public humiliation with a strength that was as quiet and unyielding as the granite of his own estate. He saw the intelligence in her clear, steady eyes. He saw the control in the line of her mouth. He saw a profound and unshakable dignity that her cheap silk dress and her lowly position could not diminish. And in that moment, something shifted inside him. The world had been a gray, muffled place for over a year, a landscape of duty and grief he navigated with cold precision. He had walled himself off from feeling, believing it a dangerous indulgence. But as he watched Cecily, he felt a flicker of something sharp and unfamiliar. It was respect, and following close behind it, a hot, unwelcome wave of shame for his own callous words. He had inherited more debts of feeling than of money, and had discharged both badly. He had judged her without knowing her, and his judgment had been found wanting. The rest of the meal passed in a strained silence. Lady Honoria, robbed of her sport, sulked. The Duke remained quiet, but his silence had changed. It was no longer a wall of dismissal. It was watchful, attentive. He noticed the gentle way Cecily smiled at a footman who nearly spilled a gravy boat. He noticed that she was the only one at the table who seemed to see his daughter at all, her gaze occasionally resting on Clara with a quiet, unobtrusive sympathy. When the dreadful dinner was finally over, Lady Honoria rose. "Miss Thorne, you will read to me in the drawing-room in half an hour." "Yes, my lady." As Cecily stood, preparing to make her escape, the Duke spoke. His voice was still low, but it had lost its arctic edge. "Miss Thorne." She stopped and turned to him, her expression questioning. He hesitated, as if the words were foreign to him. "Your father, he taught you well." It was not an apology. Not yet, but it was an acknowledgement. It was the first crack in the ice. Cecily simply inclined her head, a gesture that was neither grateful nor dismissive, and left the room. She did not go to the drawing-room. Not yet. She sought out the one place in Blackmore Manor that felt like a sanctuary, the vast, neglected conservatory at the back of the house. It was cold inside, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and dormant plants. Moonlight streamed through the high, grimy glass panels, illuminating a jungle of overgrown ferns and leggy geraniums. This was her refuge. Here, surrounded by things that grew, however wild and untended, she could breathe. She walked to a small wooden bench, half hidden behind a monstrous potted palm, and sat down. From the pocket of her dress, she took out a small, worn book of poetry and a single pressed flower. It was a primrose, its yellow faded to a delicate papery cream. She had carried it with her for 5 years. It was from the last spring, in her own home, plucked from a hedgerow that had been thick with them. A memory of a life before everything had changed. She opened the book and carefully placed the fragile flower between the pages, its ghost a testament to a time of sunshine and safety. It was a small, foolish ritual, but it was hers. It was all she had left of that world. A small sound from the doorway made her look up. Clara, the Duca's daughter, stood there, a silhouette against the lighted hall. She had slipped away from her father and her great-aunt, drawn by the silence, perhaps. For a long moment, she simply stood and watched Cecily. Then, slowly, she drifted into the conservatory, her small black shoes making no noise on the stone flags. She did not speak. Cecily had been told the child rarely did. She simply came to stand by the bench and looked at the book in Cecilia's lap. Her gaze fell upon the pressed primrose. Cecily felt the girl's silent curiosity. She did not press, did not ask what she wanted. She simply waited. After a minute, Clara lifted a small, hesitant hand and pointed a single finger at the flower. "It has a primrose," Cecily said softly, her voice gentle in the quiet space. "It was my mother's favorite. They grew all along the lanes, where I used to live. She said they were like little drops of spilled sunshine." She spoke of her own mother, a loss that was old and worn smooth with time, sensing it was a safer subject than the girl's own raw and recent grief. She was offering a bridge, built of a shared and unspoken sorrow. Clara's finger traced the air just above the flower, not quite daring to touch it. Her expression was solemn, her dark eyes huge in the moonlight. She understood. This fragile, faded thing was not just a flower. It was a piece of a person, a memory you could hold in your hand. In that quiet moment, a bond was formed, not of words, but of mutual recognition. They were two people in a cold, unfeeling house who understood the language of loss. The sound of a man's footsteps approaching made them both start. The Duke stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space. He had come looking for his daughter. He stopped when he saw the scene before him. His silent, withdrawn child, standing willingly beside the woman he had so cruelly dismissed, both of them intent on a faded flower in a book. He saw his daughter turn her head to look at him, and there was not fear in her eyes, but a quiet plea. A plea to not disturb this fragile peace. He walked toward them, his boots echoing on the stone. He did not look at his daughter, but at Cecily. His gaze was different now. The coldness was gone, replaced by a deep, searching uncertainty. "What flower is that?" he asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "A primrose, Your Grace," Cecily replied, her own voice quiet so as not to break the spell. He looked from the flower to her face, and it was as if he were seeing the pieces of a puzzle begin to fit together. The composure at the dinner table, the quiet sympathy in her eyes, the gentle way she had with his lost and lonely child. He had been looking for a solution, a functionary, a governess who could manage his daughter's grief. He had not considered that what was needed was not management, but understanding. He drew a breath. He was a man who dealt in directives and commands, not requests. But the words came, formal and a little stiff, as if he were unaccustomed to their shape. "Lady Honoria is waiting for you," he said, acknowledging the reality of her position. Then he added, his gaze holding hers, "But after you have finished with my aunta, I would speak with you in the library." He asked her to stay after supper. The same words that could have been a dismissal were now an invitation, a reversal, a beginning. Cicely looked at the powerful, grieving man before her and at his small, silent daughter, and she knew that something had irrevocably changed. "As you wish, Your Grace," she said. The half-hour with Lady Honoria was an exercise in supreme self-control. The old woman was in a foul mood, her plans for the evening's entertainment having been spoiled. She found fault with Cecilia's reading, claiming she mumbled, then that she was too loud. Cecily endured it all with the same serene patience, her mind elsewhere. She was thinking of the library, of the Duke, of the unexpected turn the night had taken. When she was finally dismissed, she made her way to the library with a heart that beat a little faster than usual. The room was her favorite in the house, a sanctuary of leather-bound books and quiet scholarship. A large fire burned in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering light over the rows of sleeping spines. The Duke was standing by the fire, one hand resting on the mantelpiece. He turned as she entered, and the look on his face was one of profound weariness, as if the armor he wore each day had grown too heavy to bear. "Miss Thorne," he began, forgoing any preamble, "thank you for coming." She simply inclined her head, waiting. He gestured to a chair. "Please." She sat, her hands folded in her lap, her posture erect. She was still his aunta's companion, a paid employee. She would not forget her place, even if he seemed to be. He did not sit. He paced before the fire, a caged lion in his own grief. "What I said in the hall earlier, Tadal, it was inexcusable. There is no other word for it. It was cruel, and it was unthinking, and I offer you my sincerest apology." The apology was blunt, stripped of all flourish, and for that reason, Cecily knew it was genuine. "Grief is not an excuse for cruelty," he continued as if speaking more to himself than to her. "But it is, I have found a cause. Since since Amelia's death, this house, my life, it has been frozen. I have not been myself. I have been a lesser version of myself." He finally stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes shadowed with a pain he could no longer conceal. "My daughter Clara, she has not truly spoken in a year. We have had a succession of governesses. Kind women, educated women, stern women. They have all failed. They all tried to replace her mother, or to erase the memory of her. They filled the silence with noise, and she simply retreated further away." He paused, his gaze dropping to the fire. "But you, tonight at dinner, you did not flinch from my aunt's cruelty, and in the conservatory you did not press my daughter. You showed her a piece of your own loss. You met her on her own ground, in silence. He had seen it all. He had understood it all. He was a man who noticed things, she realized. It was his nature, buried under layers of grief and duty. I need someone for Clara, he said, his voice raw, with a desperation he could no longer hide. Not just a teacher. Someone who understands that a memory is not a disease to be cured. Someone with a fortitude. He looked at her directly. I wish to offer you the position of governess to my daughter. At Ravenshaw, you would have your own rooms, a generous salary, and complete authority over the nursery. You would answer to no one but me. It was an astonishing offer. A lifeline out of the genteel poverty and daily humiliation of her life at Blackmore, a chance for a real home, a real purpose, hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar feeling, fluttered in her chest. Before she could form a reply, the library door opened without a knock. Lady Honoria stood there, her face a mask of thunderous disapproval. Sebastian, I thought I would find you here. What is the meaning of this private conference? Her eyes narrowed, fixing on Cecily with pure venom. She had clearly been listening, at the door. Aunt, this is a private matter, the Duke said, his voice hardening once more into a tone of command. Private. With my companion, she scoffed. I heard you, governess. You cannot be serious. Do you have any idea who this woman is? She advanced into the room, her silk dress rustling like dry, dead leaves. She was enjoying this, Cecily saw. She was a creature who fed on the unhappiness of others. You must not allow sentiment to cloud your judgment, Lady Honoria said, her voice rising with righteous indignation. This is Miss Thorne. Her father, a so-called gentleman, was a gambler and a debtor. He squandered his entire fortune and, when his creditors came calling, he took a pistol to his own head. Took the cowardice way out. Each word was a poisoned dart, aimed to kill. She was left with nothing. Her name is a disgrace. She is ruined, penniless, and tainted by scandal. To bring that into your house, to expose your innocent daughter to such a hysteria, it is an insult to your late wife's memory. What will society say? The threat was laid bare. Lady Honoria was weaponizing Cecilia's past, twisting a personal tragedy into a public shame. She was trying to make her toxic, to force the Duke to recoil from the taint of her story. The room was silent save for the crackling of the fire. The Duke stood like a statue, his expression unreadable. Cecily felt a cold dread creep into her limbs. It was all true. The bare, ugly facts of it. She had lost everything. Kafai. Her name was worthless. By the world's standards, she was nothing. Lady Honoria had spoken the truth, but her father had taught her another lesson, that the truth was a matter of interpretation. Cecily rose from her chair. She did not look at the Duke, whose silence felt like a judgment. She faced Lady Honoria, her chin held high. Everything your ladyship says is true, she said, her voice as calm and steady as a prayer. My father was ruined by a man he trusted, and in his despair he ended his life. I do not carry his shame. I carry his memory. There is a difference. She refused to be defined by the scandal. She claimed the story as her own, and in doing so stripped it of its power to wound her. She would not be small. She would not be broken. A small movement at the door made them all turn. Clara stood there, her small hand clutching the doorframe. She must have followed her father, or perhaps she had heard the raised voices. Her dark eyes were wide, moving from her great-aunt's furious face to Cecilia's calm one. Lady Honoria saw her and pounced. You see, the child is witness to this assorted discussion. You must send this woman away, Sebastian, for Clara's sake. But Clara was not looking at her great-aunt. She was looking at Cecily, and in her eyes was a fierce, protective light that Cecily had never seen there before. Then, the child did something extraordinary. She let go of the door frame. She walked deliberately into the room, her small black shoes resolute on the Persian rug. She walked past her great-aunt, as if she were not there. She walked past her father, who watched her, his breath caught in his throat. She walked directly to Cecily. She reached out and took Cecilia's hand in her own, her small fingers curling around Cecilia's, with surprising strength. Then, from the tiny pocket of her morning dress, she pulled out a single, slightly crushed primrose. She must have gone back to the conservatory to rescue it. She held it up for her father to see. And then she looked at Cecily and spoke her first clear, unambiguous word in over a year. A word that was both a plea and a command. Stay. The single word fell into the charged silence of the room and changed everything. It was a choice, a declaration. The child, whom everyone had tried to protect and manage, had just protected and chosen for herself. Sebastian, the Duke of Ravenshaw, looked at his daughter's small, determined face, her hand gripping Cecilia's as if it were a lifeline. He looked at the simple, wilted flower she held up as a banner. And he looked at Cecily Thorne, the woman his aunt called ruined, who had just met the worst of the world as judgment with unwavering grace. He saw not ruin, but resilience. He saw not disgrace, but dignity. He saw the woman who had reached his daughter's silent heart when all his power and wealth had failed. In that moment, the last of the ice around his own heart cracked and fell away. He turned to his aunt. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it carried the chilling authority of a judge passing sentence. You have lived in this house for 40 years, Aunt, surrounded by every comfort, and you have learned nothing of value. You speak of shame, but you know nothing of honor. You speak of memory, but you seek only to wound. He took a step forward, placing himself beside Cecily and his daughter, forming a new, unbreakable unit. Miss Thorne has lost everything, and yet she has retained what matters. She will not only be Clara's governess, she will have any position in my household she desires, with a status second only to my own. And you, Aunt Honoria, will address her from this moment forward with the respect she is due, for she is now under my protection. It was a declaration of belonging, a public claiming. He had not offered marriage, not yet, but he had offered something more fundamental. He had offered his shield. He had chosen her in front of the very person who sought to destroy her. Lady Honoria's face was a mask of disbelief, then fury, then finally, the pinched, sour look of defeat. She had been rendered irrelevant. She had lost her power over all of them. Without another word, she turned and swept from the room, leaving behind a silence that was no longer cold and empty, but filled with a fragile, burgeoning warmth. After his aunt had gone, the Duke knelt down, so that he was on a level with his daughter. He gently touched her cheek. "You were very brave, Clara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. Clara just nodded, her eyes shining, and pressed the primrose into Cecilia's free hand. Later that night, long after Clara was asleep, Cecily found the Duke again in the library. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the room was filled with a soft, peaceful dark. He was standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit grounds. He turned as she entered, and the smile he gave her was small and sad, but it was the first time she had seen him smile at all. "I imagine you will be glad to leave this place," he said. "Blackmore has been my home for 5 years," she replied quietly. "It was not always a happy one, but it was a safe one. I am grateful for that." There was no bitterness in her voice, only truth. He walked over to her, his steps slow and deliberate. "I have not been honest with you, Miss Thorne." Cecily, the sound of her given name on his lips was startlingly intimate. "My wife Asda." "It was not a gentle fating," he said, his voice low. "It was a riding accident. Sudden, violent. One moment she was there, laughing, and the next she was gone." He stopped, the memory, clearly, still raw. "I have blamed myself for it every day for the past year. If I had checked her saddle more closely, if we had chosen a different path, 1,000 ifs. The guilt, it has been a kind of poison. I thought if I felt nothing, if I closed myself off from the world, I could not fail anyone again." He looked at her, his eyes full of a terrible lonely pain. "I was wrong. I was just failing in a different way. I was failing myself. I walled us up in ice and called it protection. He reached out, and with a hesitation that spoke volumes, he gently touched her arm. His touch was warm. Then you came. And you sat at my aunt's table, and you refused to be broken. You met her cruelty, not with anger, but with a quiet truth that was more powerful than any shield I have ever built. You showed me what real strength is. It is not the absence of feeling, it is the courage to feel and to endure. He let his hand fall away. When I offered you the position of governess, it was for Clara. I saw how you reached her, but I was a coward. I was hiding behind my daughter's needs. He took a deep breath, like a man about to dive into deep water. I am asking you to come to Ravenshaw, Cecily, but not as a governess, not as a solution to a problem. I am asking you to stay out for my sake, because you have made me feel something other than grief and guilt for the first time in a year. You have made me feel hope. Cecily looked into his earnest, vulnerable face. She saw the good man buried beneath the duke, the grieving husband, the frightened father. Her heart, so long guarded, ached for him, but she had to be sure. Her own survival had taught her to be wary of grand gestures, born of momentary gratitude. Your Grace, she said, her voice gentle but firm. Sebastian, do not mistake gratitude for something more. He stepped closer, closing the small distance between them. The warmth of the fire, of his presence, enveloped her. There is gratitude, he said, his voice a low murmur. I will be grateful to you for the rest of my life for what you did for my daughter. But it is not a mistake. He lifted a hand and brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his touch feather-light. I see you, Cecily. When I had forgotten how to see anyone at all, and then he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of discovery. It was gentle, questioning, and deeply, achingly tender. It was a kiss that promised not a fairy tale, but something far more real and precious. A shared and quiet healing. When he drew back, he rested his forehead against hers. Stay, he whispered, the word an echo of his daughter's plea. This time, it was not a request, it was a prayer. And Cecily, who had spent 5 years learning how to be invisible, finally felt seen. I will, she whispered back. 6 months later, the sun streamed through the tall, clean windows of Ravenshaw, a house that had learned how to breathe again. The silence that had once haunted its halls was gone, replaced by the sound of a child's footsteps running on the polished floors, and sometimes the sound of her laughter. The heavy velvet curtains had been drawn back, and bowls of fresh flower soften, simple primroses, gathered from the Estadas Woods, graced the tables. The late Duchess's portrait still hung in its place of honor, in the long gallery. Cecily had insisted upon it. She and Clara often stood before it, and Cecily would tell the little girl stories she had gleaned from the staff about her mother's love of horses and her beautiful singing voice. The dead were not erased at Ravenshaw. They were remembered with love, their memory a foundation upon which a new family was being carefully, tenderly built. Lady Honoria was a distant, bitter memory, her spiteful letters left unanswered in a drawer. One bright autumn afternoon, Sebastian found Cecily in the walled garden. Clara was nearby, her head bent in concentration, as she showed her governess now, her father's betrothed, Robinaz, nest she had discovered in the ivy. The air was crisp and smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. Sebastian came to stand beside her, a quiet contentment settling over his features as he watched his daughter. He no longer looked like a man carved from stone. The lines of grief had softened, replaced by a warmth that lived always in his eyes when he looked at Cecily or Clara. He slipped a small velvet-wrapped box into her hand. I had something made for you, he said quietly. She opened it. Nestled on the dark blue velvet was not a spectacular diamond or a heavy jewel, but a simple, elegant gold locket. She lifted it, her fingers tracing its smooth surface. When she pressed the small clasp, it sprang open. Inside, There was no miniature portrait. Instead, set perfectly beneath a dome of clear, flawless crystal, was a single, tiny, pressed primrose. It was preserved forever, its delicate, creamy yellow color captured and protected from the ravages of time, the central image of her past, of her survival, transformed into a promise for her future. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears. She did not bother to hide. He smiled, a real easy smile that reached his eyes. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. He did not need grand pronouncements or flowery speeches. 3 words were all that were needed. They held everything: the past, the present, and all the hopeful days to come. For the woman who stayed. Cecily looked from his beloved face to his happy, chattering child, and then at the beautiful, blooming garden all around them. It was not a whirlwind romance that had saved them. It was something quieter, stronger, and more deeply rooted. It was the simple, profound courage to endure, to speak the truth, and to see the enduring worth in one small, overlooked flower. She had a home, she had a family, she was chosen, and she was loved. What did you think of Cecily's quiet strength in the face of Lady Honoria's cruelty? It is often the quietest people who possess the deepest reserves of courage. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know where you are watching from and what your favorite moment of the story was. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories of love, courage, and unexpected, happily ever afters. We have a new story waiting for you tomorrow, and we cannot wait to share it with you. Thank you for listening.